And go ahead and enable. And go ahead and enable. All right, confirming that the live is going, which is great. And admitting all of those who are in the waiting room. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation today, hosted by The World is Watching, African Views, and the Alliance for South-South Global Cooperation. My name is Alexandra Maloney. I am the founder and president of The World is Watching, and I'm also a board member of the Black Professionals in International Affairs. Joining me today on this panel discussion around the African diaspora is Queen Diambi, who is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Dr. Wale, who is the founder and executive director of African Views, Dr. Christopher A. House, who is a professor at Ithaca College, Jonathan Cummings, from representing the Alliance of NGOs and CSOs for South-South Cooperation, Mapone, who is a member of the African National Congress, and Vannery Kong, who is also a Black Professionals in International Affairs board member, as well as the G7 Youth Summit Global Connectivity and Trade Sherpa. So I'm very excited to have everyone here speaking today. We will have I'll begin with a few questions, and then about halfway through, please, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat in this conversation. So this will be recorded, and we're currently broadcasting live on YouTube. So thank you so much to all of our panelists and those who are joining here for this conversation today.
Thank you.
So, sure. So I'd like to start off by asking each of our panelists to share, how would you define the African diaspora, and what is the global cultural significance of the African diaspora? So maybe we can start with Queen Diambi.
Thank you for inviting me on this panel, and thank you very much to everybody who's present. Everyone in this panel is a very dear friend of mine. I want to give shout out to Dr. Wale, who's a dear friend of mine, and Jonathan, of course, and everybody else. So I'm very happy to be again in the company of great minds and great hearts to work on this program today. So you basically mentioned about the significance of the African diaspora. I mean, it's really something that, you know, we could talk for hours about, just talking about the history of the African diaspora. It's a very diverse and eclectic, you know, body of, you know, experiences and of people. Let's not forget that, you know, the diaspora is really, when you talk about the first African diaspora, is the entire planet, because all the planet comes from Africa. Every single human being originates from Africa. So all the planet are really, you know, diasporic population from the continent of Africa. So let's not forget that we only left Africa 70,000 years ago, and the latest major migrations happened only about 10,000 years ago, until we come to the more recent history of the human trafficking period that happened, you know, for 400 years. And matter of fact, we are celebrating Juneteenth today. It's a very special holiday in the United States, you know, talking about the liberation and the emancipation of the African people on the entire territory of what is now known as the United States. So we have very diverse experience of diaspora, because we have the ancient or historical diaspora that has been, you know, brought from Africa to different colonies or different, you know, places that were called the New World, and of course also in Europe as well, because we oftentimes fail to mention that many Africans were, you know, taken during the human trafficking period and brought to Europe as well. So we have that historical diaspora that is very much that very much developed itself according to different, historical paradigm, and we're putting forced labor camp in different, with different cultures, associated to different cultures. We have people like in Brazil. I'm also queen of the African descendants of Brazil since last year, and so the experience of African Brazilians, the experience of African Cubans, Africans in the Caribbean, African in the United States. So all that are very much diverse experience, although they are all behind the backdrop of, this human trafficking period of 400 years that happened in Africa with, between the European powers and the African continent. And we are not even talking about the diaspora, the African diaspora that is in Asia, because there too, many Africans have been also taken, through the Arabic, human trafficking period that lasted over 800 years. Many Africans from the East Coast and from Central Africa has been taken away and brought to what they call today the Middle East, and subsequently Asia. So the diasporic experience of African people is very, very diverse. And then after the colonization comes now a new wave of African people who goes to Europe, who goes to the Americas. And I am part of those who lived in Europe and came to live in America. So I find with me here an abundant community, a flourishing community of African people who are still very much tied to the country because they are maybe first or second or maybe third generation from the continent. And yet again, they have made of new countries their home. So when we talk about African diaspora, we're talking about 350 million people, with so many of them who have linked still in Africa. So it's also, the most recent diaspora or the modern diaspora can also represent a bridge to connect between the continent and the other parts of the world, which is the case for most of us. Every one of us, we call home, we send money home, we start businesses home, we engage with, the political scene that's happening in the home. We are very concerned. Some of us kept the nationality, so we are still voting. So it's so very much interesting and more complex than what we want to imagine. It's such an amazing body of experience, of people, of different kinds, and to see the African community really all over the world start coming together to build this unique consciousness of belonging to a particular continent, or more so to belong to a particular experience, and also have in front of us similar challenges. It's something that is really commendable that we are now able to do so after so many masters have come before us to tell us that the unity of Africa was essential, and that included, of course, the diaspora. Thank you.
Beautiful answer. Thank you so much for all of that information and perspective. That could be the conversation right there. So I'll go ahead. My next question is directed to Dr. House. And the question is in relation to the impact of the rhetoric right now that we are hearing and seeing with the Black Lives Matter protest and movement at large, and how this is, one, affecting Black communities in the US, but also an opportunity to connect with Black communities around the world around this particular topic. So could you share a little bit about how this rhetoric may be, and the events that are occurring, how this affects the Black community at large around the world? And you're currently muted.
Right.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Yep.
All right. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. The Black Lives Matter movement. That saying, that mantra, Black Lives Matter, is something that that Black folks have been saying in so many different ways since arriving in Jamestown and years before that, to say that we are human. The 13th Amendment, which freed slaves in the United States, it said we were free, but it never said we were human. And so we have had to say we are human. We've had to assert our humanity in so many different ways. We've had to, Sojourner Truth asserted her humanity when she said, "Ain't I a woman?" You have so many different other folks who had slogans and saying, civil rights movement, "I am a man." So many other sayings that were really trying to assert our humanity. because, you know, there's been a characterological assault on Blackness. Blackness was not thought to be connected with the world of rationality and thought. Blackness was said to be, Black skin was said to be a sign of perpetual servitude. You know, we were said to be savages, said to be criminal. Blackness was criminalized. And so we have had to assert our humanity in so many different ways. And, you know, one thing about it is that the Black Lives Matter movement is not just a US movement. It is a movement that has resonated all across the world as people of, as African people and people of African ancestry. We have had to assert our humanity in so many different ways. And so there is this deep connection. You know, we are marked by this idea, this cultural assertion of who we are. We had an identity that was imposed upon us rhetorically, and then we've had an identity that we have asserted from the beginning. We have asserted that we are people made in the image of God. We are humans. And so you're seeing this connection all across the world. You see it through various forms of resistance. And what we're seeing on the streets is we're seeing people pushing back. We're seeing people who are fed up, people who are tired. We have seen progress within America, the US context, we've seen progress, but we haven't seen equality. And so we're pushing back, and rhetoric is a very, very, and by rhetoric, I just mean the way signs and symbols influence human thought and behavior, how images, how words, you know, and then when you get into words, you get into policies and laws, how those things have been used to shape and define who and what Black people are, and then who and what white people are. Right, it creates this whole racial hierarchy, and this idea of whiteness it has impacted the entire world. And you know, and behind that, the idea of whiteness, who and what white people are, is this other thing that's green, and that's called money, which has you know, which drove the transatlantic slave trade. Racism became a justification for it. It wasn't the cause for it. It was greed. It was money. It was power. And so Black Lives Matter is challenging this notion. We're still pressing forward, we're still advancing. And so I think, you know, you're seeing that connection around the world because Blackness is under assault all over the world. And so people are rising up and asserting our humanity and asserting our identity and demanding equal rights and equality.
Thank you so much, Dr. House, for that potent response. My next question is open to all panelists, but I think that in particular, if we could hear from Jonathan and Vannery on this, because the question is, as it relates to your culture or your upbringing, please discuss your opinions on Black cultural identity. And I think when we have conversations about the African diaspora, we typically, there's a larger focus on those who are on the African continent and those who are in the United States. But Jonathan, as a member of the Caribbean community, and Vannery as a member of both the Black community, representing the Black community, and the Asian, the Cambodian community, the reality that the African diaspora truly is a global phenomena, as Queen Diambi mentioned, that Black, you know, communities are almost on every continent. I don't know if we're in Antarctica yet, but we're almost on every continent. So Jonathan, maybe you could start more on your opinions of Black cultural identity, and what does that mean? What does that look like to you?
Thank you, Alexandria, and thank you to Dr. House and Queen Diambi for your very insightful responses. And I'm going to echo something that Queen Diambi said when she was talking about the Black diaspora. She said that it's a really complex system of culture and people, and I completely agree with that. And to your point, the Black diaspora, the African diaspora, is scattered throughout the entire world. And for me, particularly, I'm originally from Jamaica, and I lived in Jamaica for 16 years of my life. And I moved to the United States, lived in New York City, Bronx specifically, and lived in Ithaca for 7 years, and I'm back in New York. But the Black identity of the Caribbean and Jamaica specifically, it's very unique. It's very interesting because you see, Jamaica, as far as many countries go, dare I say this about Jamaica, it's a small country with little under 3 million people, but has a big ego. It's a massive cultural heavyweight. And some of it's rightfully so. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, Jamaica invented reggae and dancehall, and people in Japan listen to reggae and dancehall. Everyone knows the food of Jamaica. Everyone loves oxtail and all these things. And we invented Rastafarianism. And some of the people from Jamaica, they are iconic. You have Marcus Garvey, Usain Bolt, Bob Marley. Obviously, everyone knows Bob Marley, and even members of the Jamaican diaspora. We have Senator Kamala Harris, who ran for president of the United States. Her family's from Jamaica. Secretary of State Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State, his family's from Jamaica. So, I mean, I understand where Jamaica gets this ego from, if I say it's ego, and you can see it reflected in its people. In all honesty, so growing up, it was an interesting time growing up, because when I grew up, I had the concept of race and blackness in Jamaica, for me specifically. It was very different before moving to the United States. So in Jamaica, I guess I'm brown. People would say I'm brown in Jamaica. But when you come to the United States, everyone just labels you as black. But you see, in Jamaica, what it is, or I think this is throughout the Caribbean, yes, race is a thing wherever you go. Race is a thing. But the thing with Jamaica, or maybe I say the Caribbean, is that it's not something that we think about consistently. The primary issue there, what people see more, is classism versus racism. So I grew up in that environment where a majority of the people around me were black and brown people. I mean, yes, we had some people who are Asian or white and this and that, but we just saw them as Jamaicans. And so when I moved to the United States, specifically at the age of 16, where I'm starting to solidify my cultural identity about who I am and what's my place in the world. That's for the first time. That was when I started really thinking about what it meant to be black, not just in the United States, but in the world. Because, like I said, in Jamaica, yes, race is a thing, and we all. I mean, it's pretty evident to me. The country was colonized by Britain and Spanish at one point, and throughout the Caribbean, if you're colonized, I mean, yeah, race is going to be a thing. It's used as a system of division to divide the people and maintain power. I get it. But when you come to the United States, it's always pronounced. And especially when I went to school in Ithaca, I lived in Ithaca for 7 years. I went to Ithaca College for 4 years. Ithaca College is unique in the sense where race and talking about cultural identity it always happens. It it's I believe now it's required for students to talk about race and to take a diversity component. And so moving from Jamaica to New York, where I was just learning about what it meant to be black, and coming to Ithaca, where you can't escape talking about cultural identity and race and diversity and these different things. It really had a massive impact on my cultural identity. Even right now, I'm still trying to process everything, and I'm still trying to learn everything, because I grew up in a country where I basically was a majority, right? We never really thought about race as much as people in the United States. And I moved to New York City, in the Bronx, where a majority of the people there actually were Hispanic and black. And I came to Ithaca, where a majority of the people are white, and everyone's talking about racial identity and all these different things. So personally, my cultural identity and what it means to be black, I'm still developing it. I feel like it changes every so often. But one thing I know is that within the United States and globally, from my studies here in New York and just being living in the United States, one thing I know is that I've now seen, and now I've had a better understanding of how Black people are systematically oppressed globally. And that is something I learned coming to the United States, because there are subtle systematic issues that are just there keeping people of color oppressed, And so I learned a lot about this, and it's, like I said, it's still impacted. It has had an impact on my identity, and I'm still learning about it. But I'm more, dare I say, I'm more woke now to everything, and I'm just learning more about myself and my cultural heritage and everything. So, yeah. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing. Vannery, your opinion on Black cultural identity as one person who identifies with multiple cultures. Could you speak to, what your opinion is on that and how it relates to your own culture or your own upbringing?
Yes, thank you, Alexandra. And I just want to thank the panel. It's such an honor to be on the same panel as you Dr. House, and Queen Diana and Jonathan and Mopon. So I think when I was growing up, I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana. So everyone knows that's the birthplace state of the Ku Klux Klan. So I definitely had my fair share of whether not being Black enough, not being Asian enough. And I don't think I think as young as I can remember, I don't think I really conceptualized race probably until I was 10. My mom never really she told me that I was Cambodian, but I just assumed that every Black household like spoke Khmer because it never was really explained to me. And I remember one time in particular, my grandmother on my dad's side was making rice, but I kept saying, like speaking Cambodian to her, I said, go, Numbai. And she was just like, why do you keep calling it Bai? And I was like, that's the word. And she's like, no, this is rice. And I remember it was Uncle Ben's because I was like, why are you cooking it of Uncle Ben's versus getting it from the Asian grocery store? So I think that was like the youngest time I recalled seeing like that major difference. But Blackness in the Asian community is always very interesting because I know personally for me in Cambodia, there's always colorism is like a really big thing. So if you're really tan, you're looked at as, being poor, uneducated because you have to work in the rice fields all day. And it's really interesting. Another friend of mine who's also Cambodian Black, we also kind of had this revelation where during our civil war in the late 70s, the Khmer Rouge War, if you went through the Khao Idang refugee camp, and if you were a certain color, you were sent to the United States. And if you were from a certain socioeconomic class, which were the farmers or like the entry level. So my grandfather happened to, he was a farmer, but he worked his way up and worked for the US Embassy. But if you went through a different camp in the southern part of Vietnam, you had money, and I'm sorry, yeah, in the southern part of Vietnam, southern part of Thailand, excuse me, then you went to France because your family had money. And those were the more Chinese mixes, the lighter skinned Cambodians. And so they tend to look down, or the Cambodians from the US, because we have more Blackness in us and we're more closely related. So our original group in Cambodians are called Austronesians. And if you look at the origins of the Asian tribes, like the Banyan Temple in Angkor Wat, we have African features. We have the big flat noses, big lips. Cambodians, we are always known, we're actually called the Blacks of Asia with the Laotians, or we call them Lao people. But, and we have a lot of tribes in Asia too, but I feel like because of the colonization from the French in the Indochina region, and with the intervention of the East Asians, the light-skinned Asians, they tried to actually wipe out that Black history that was so interwoven into the origins of Asia. So even in the Philippines, the original Filipinos were called negritos, so a lot of the tribes had a lot of melanin in us. And that tends to be forgotten due to colorism, and everyone wants to look like the Koreans, except for me. I enjoy my melanin. So, I just think that now I've just started to notice, even within the Asian community, there's been like a definitely polar views on whether to support Black Lives Matter, but I've noticed there's been more initiatives to regain that history that was lost. And when you actually look at why the Khmer Rouge War was started, it was because Cambodia was on the brink of like its own enlightenment period because we were growing economically. So when Pol Pot took over and told the king, Prince Sihanouk, to go to France and take over, they were killing off a lot of the light-skinned Asians. They wanted to bring the original Cambodians back. But then with that, they were destroying our history books, our leaders, our scholars, and a lot of those were melanated Asians along too, because not only were they killing off the light-skinned Asians, but they were also killing off the scholars. So a lot of our culture is lost, and they're trying to brainwash it with this idea that we were Chinese, but we weren't. The Angkor kingdom was like way more powerful than the original ancient Chinese kingdom. So when they came down to see us, they called us jungle Asians because we were so tan and because we were so advanced. We have way more temples than they do in East Asia. And some are still getting discovered to this day because it was overgrown by the jungles right now. And even when you look at the treatment of the tribes, outside of doing work with The World is Watching, there was way back when French colonized Indochina, there was a piece of land that was actually given to Vietnam that was taken away from Cambodia. And on this piece of land, there was this indigenous group called Khmer Krom. We actually have quite a few of them in the United States, but there are melanated Asians as well. They actually have their own language, their own culture, and we love them. But there's so many human rights issues because it's on the southern part of Vietnam, and because they're not Vietnamese, the government's like, we're not taking care of you guys. So the organization I work with Mata Sailing Center, they actually come in and establish a school and keep that cultural preservation. And legend has it that there's actually temples there that still exist from back in the 1700s when Christ walked the earth. And so the king of this tribe said, hey, we want our people to understand our culture. Can you just behead me and keep the statue? Until this day, Vietnam has, kept that, trying to preserve at least 80% of the indigenous history that has been from Africa.
Vannery, thank you so much, because I'm learning new things here as you share. So thank you for being here and contributing to this conversation. My next question is directed to Dr. Wale and to Mapone. What role do you all think that international and multilateral organizations can play in the empowerment of the African diaspora? So I'll start with Dr. Wale, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking you, Jonathan, for supporting this initiative. It is something that is very dear to our Arts at African Views. As you know, we have peddled similar ideas. The world is listening for so many years. And we're so grateful that young people like you are able to continue this. I'm so pleased to meet Alexandria. I think you're beautiful and brilliant. This is the type of front that we need in order to advance the cause. So pleased to hear from Vannery. Thank you for bringing that perspective, and it is so crucial that we understand the global presence of African people. I salute Queen Diambi, and I salute Mr. Chris House, I believe. Is that right? And the rest of the panelists, I can't see the entirety of the names, but I just wanted to thank you all for this discussion, especially today on Juneteenth. Wow, where do we begin when it comes to institution and organization and the African diaspora? It's not a simple question as it might seem, because first of all, we need to understand the concept of institution and the concept of organization. So what does that really mean in a global context? I do understand the question, but I think that it is important for us to analyze it so that when we break it down, we can fit it appropriately to the needs of the African diaspora. And I also find a very important need to provide a definition, at least as the AU defined it, the African Union, what the African diaspora is. I think it's important for us to have that understanding. So when we're talking about organization, is that which organizes, and that which institutes is that which institutionalizes, right? So when we're talking about international organization, we're talking about really decrees and big edifices like the United Nations, the IMF, and all of those guys. It's important that we put that into context, except we narrow it down to non-governmental international organizations that are working on African issues. These are the reasons I want us to really put these things in perspective so we can align it appropriately on the puzzle. Okay, so the organization really often come ahead of the institute because they are which brings the institute about. Now, when it comes to the African diaspora, the AU were forced to define it. And what they said is that any indigent, any person who is an indigene or a citizen or has any amount of pedigree, regardless of the one-drop rule, anywhere in the world that could trace his ancestry back to the African continent, he's an African. I think that's fabulous. Now, but what exactly is Africa itself? I think it's important we begin with that. This is important for us to really put all of this in perspective, because I hear young people, I see that gap, and it is our fault if we're not able to bring this knowledge about, because we have the resources. So the concept of Africa is not a natural one. It was named Africa. Like everything else, even language was invented. So there's nothing wrong about that. Africa in its originality means a warm and peaceful place. Afriki, a warm and peaceful place. This is why all the warring Asians and Europeans could find refuge in Africa. This is why they understood Africa. This is why slavery started long before the European incursions. We're going to jump a little bit quickly, so to come to the concept of the institutions and the organizations. Because of the global perspective on Africa, the direction of the outlook is always inwards. What can the world do for Africa rather than what can Africa do for the world? You see, that already puts us in a bind. I gotta explain to you, in Africa, there are hundreds of thousands of ethnic groups. Hundreds of thousands. They speak different languages. They are different nations by nature. But that's not uncommon. Whether you're a Jamaican or a Trinidadian or Haitian or anything else for that matter, even in Europe, Suriname, anywhere, you have a development of a new African ethnic group. Okay? A development of a new African ethnic group. And the difference from one to another is not any more different than the difference between a Yoruba and an Akan, or any other tribe for that matter. What about the languages? The languages evolved. Look, in Haiti today, they speak a completely different African language that no one speaks in Africa. It's the same in Suriname and in many other places, because that's evolution. So I want us to really have a good understanding of ourselves. We are an inseparable people. And to me, it is completely wrong to call anyone white or black. We are a people of African descent. And it's important that we keep that in our minds. Yes, we should be proud of our nationality, but we should understand the difference between nationality and ethnicity and race. It's important that we know that. So, coming back to the organizations, you know, many entities are very concerned. It's whenever an issue about African people happens anywhere in the world, we are naturally concerned. Generally, every one of us, even the ones that are pro-white rally or whatever the case may be, there is some degree of concern there. It's just the previous educational background and perspective that really navigates our perception and our outlook on that, as well as our utterances. So there are some organizations. The AU is concerned. The United Nations is concerned. They have issued a lot of comments about the current situation, racial condition and racial conflict in the United States. The leader of the African Union came out and he spoke about it. He said that he's wrong. The United Nations came out. You know, they do this always. During Barack Obama's regime, he created something called YALI. I don't know if you're familiar with it. You are, wonderful. So I spoke at the State Department on this issue. And I thought, yeah, it's a good idea to create YALI, which is again one perspective of Africans coming out here in the United States to get support. But I am arguing for African diaspora that needs support in going to Africa. There are lots of that happening. There are lots of that happening on individual level, on different organizational level, those going back for repatriation, there's lots of that, but it needs a strong policy behind it. It needs a strong policy behind it, it needs a strong movement behind it. It needs for us all to understand the importance of that reconnection. It's part of the reparation. We're talking about generations upon generations of oppression and unreviewed damages to our psyche, to our physical appearances, to our emotional conditions, to everything, our perceptions, our education, our direction, our limits in performance. So when we're talking about reparations, we should take it very seriously and should be argued at in the Congress. And all these organizations and institutions, whether big or small, should be appropriated with the right resources to support this, because no one can do it alone. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Wale, for all of those substantive points and very, very important points as we look at not only at the theoretical level of what this connection of the African diaspora could be, but at a very practical and institutional level. What could that look like? So thank you so much. Mapone, I'll ask if you can share next. What role do you believe that international and multilateral organizations can play in the empowerment of the African diaspora?
I don't know if I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for having invited me to this platform. I think it's quite important for ourselves, especially as young people, to actually have a view on what is happening around the world and also to empower each other as especially Black people. So I think the doctor has already said a mouthful, so I'm just going to add on what I think also should be the role of international and multilateral organizations. First and foremost, I think that these organizations have, in the current situation, are playing, would be strategic agents of development. We have a lot of policies, we have a lot of things in writing that speak about the African diaspora. We have everything that's says there's so many policies of the United Nations, of the African Union. What I think is important at this current point in time is that we must focus on implementation, because the policies are there, yes. However, on the implementation part, there is some lag or there's some lagging behind. So what we would need is to ensure that these international organizations actually do their role in terms of this implementation. Also understanding what is important is for us to understand, as the doctor was saying, that there is a lot of different Black cultures. There's a lot of ethnic groups. I mean, in South Africa, for one, we have 11 ethnic groups, and I don't think it's something that is known. So what is important, even within these organizations, is to ensure that we are aware of the different Black cultures within the African continent, those that are not from who are currently not residing in the African continent, with all Africans all over the world. We need to ensure that these organizations, the organizations that are in solidarity with the African diaspora, are actually able to have all of those movements, because it is a big movement. It's not something that only one person can focus on, something that all of us at the end of the day need to unite and hold our hands together and be able to try and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mapone. So at this time, I'm going to ask the last question that I have, and then I'll also ask each of the panelists to share their concluding thoughts before we open it up for Q&A from the audience. So the last question that I have is, what role do you see young people playing in the empowerment of the African diaspora, especially with the creation of, with the technology that we have now that allows us a greater opportunity to connect as all people of all generations, but particularly the young generations of Black communities around the world. So if you have anything to say on that, please do. And if you have any concluding thoughts on this conversation. So we'll start with Queen Diambi, if you would be open to sharing first.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm very pleased to have heard, some of the reflection that everybody in the panel talked about, and I want to maybe piggyback on some things about, the African identity. And I think, just as I mentioned before, the African identity is quite complex. It's not so simplistic as to say there is such thing as one African identity. However, just like Jonathan was mentioning, sometimes when we live or come from different places, like I grew up in Kinshasa, there was no such thing as African identity in Kinshasa because everybody is, African there, everybody's more or less looking the same. And we are more like, talking about our country, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and so forth. And then coming outside of Africa sometimes is when you realize, that there is indeed a commonality between the different experiences, and especially in terms of where our challenges stands. So when we look at, when I came to the United States, and I keep saying I became African in the United States more than I was in Africa, because in Africa I was just me. And I never was asked, what are you? Put your demographic in a demographic, put, the cross on the box that identify you, ethnically, or racially. Quote unquote, because there is no such thing as race. This is a concept that was invented. We are only a species with different variety of features because of the environment in which we we develop ourselves. We continue to develop ourselves, so we adapt to the environment, but we are only one species, which is the human species. So coming out of Africa made me realize and made me see that the conditions of African people, or people looking like me, was very much the same. Even when we talk about, Jonathan mentioned, no, in Jamaica we're almost the same. It's just a question of class. But yet again, I will say, what is class if not also the elements defined by what we call white supremacy today, or white paradigm, or European paradigm? Because when you look at it, most of the people that I remember in Congo being the wealthiest people were mostly people that let go of a lot of what identified them as being African, in the core. So they let go of their languages. Sometimes they let go of the lifestyle. They let go of even the clothing. They want to let go of the color of the skin. A lot of things make a cleavage between the social classes. And of course, oftentimes the people who are more well off are the ones who studied it in Europe, have these big degrees from those big schools, and have a European lifestyle. So even though it's class only, but it also shows that the closest you are to the European paradigm, the more successful you are, even on the African continent. So I became African here because indeed Dr. Wale was explaining that Africa is a composite of so many different tribes, and so we had kingdoms, we had just like everywhere else. So we didn't develop necessarily a consciousness of being African. What makes us an Africa is basically the conglomerate of a common experience that we underwent. So the experience of being basically the target of predatory practices, economic predatory practices until today. So between the human trafficking that people call slave trade, which I believe it was not a trade, but rather a traffic, and this experience, and then the fact that later on the exploitation of the continent and the people of the continent happened on the continent, which is just a continuation of the same economic predatory practices, had led us to be, facing the same challenges today all over the world. So when I came out of Africa, and I saw that in the United States, the people who were the poorest, the people who had the least the access to healthcare, education, housing, safety, were the people that look like me. I go to Brazil, same thing. I go to Cuba, same thing. I go to Jamaica, same thing. I go to Dominican Republic, same thing. I go to Europe, same thing. I go to Asia, same thing. So something there is a conductor, is a common denominator that makes us Africa. Because at the end of the day, we realize that the reason why we are basically being treated this way is because we are African. And of course, we can go into history and understand that all this propaganda was done to justify abject behavior against other human beings. So the humans had to be dehumanized in order for this behavior to be able to be carried on with a light consciousness. So it's in our history that we find the fundamental element that created these divides. And because we are all victims of the same, the same label, we have to fight together against the same issues. And this is where the idea of Africa becomes quite interesting. And let's not forget that the idea of Africa comes first from outside of Africa. When you look at Pan-Africanism, it's not an indigenous African idea. It's actually the people who underwent human trafficking, who came to the New World, who had to compose a new African citizen because they mixed with all these famous tribes and from East Coast, from Central Africa, and all people that didn't speak the same languages were able to make an African. What really is an African is a mix of all of these people. And from that came the idea of Pan-Africanism and the necessity to reconnect with the continent in order to regain that strength and to rebuild a common identity, although with different facets. So this is what I find to be interesting, is to find out that the idea of Africa is a necessity so that people that look like us, who have been victim over centuries and centuries, and it's not even centuries, I would say millennium, because the propaganda against black skin, melanated people, and of African origin is already started around 2,800 years. So when the Assyrian invade Kemet and starting to do this campaign. So we are all victim of a campaign of dehumanization, and those cliches are stuck because even they did scientific racism. They tried to justify why we had to be treated less than humans, and they tried all kinds of ways, anthropology, science. There's so many different things that came along to explain away how they could treat African people the way they did. But today it's a new day. The youth is only standing on the shoulders of the ancient. There's nothing new to what the young people are doing. They are carrying on the legacy of the ones who have come before them, because make no mistake, we have been fighting ever since. There was never a time where African people say African life do not matter. We've been fighting from the moment of invasion, from the moment of colonization. We fought against human trafficking. There were many wars, many rebellions in the different plantation and territories where Africans were exploited all over the world. There were human rights fights, civil rights fights everywhere on the planet. So African life, Black Lives Matter, always. We never gave up. So these young men may have a nice label for it today because we have the social media, and now we can communicate with each other and see that we are all living under the same banner of injustice and inequality that's perpetuated by systemic problems in the structure of governance. And this is what is new, but we've been fighting
for the longest time. My ancestors were fighting. I am standing on top of the shoulders of people like Marcus Garvey, like Martin Luther King, like, you know, Malcolm X. I'm standing on their shoulders. So these young people are not continuing, but they have a wonderful tool now. And it's also a tool, let's not forget, that is based on African science, because the binary code system that is, you know, the system that we are using for all the electronics and all the computer science, it's really a fundamental system of storing information that was invented in Africa. And I think people from Nigeria, and especially Dr. Wale, will not contradict me when we talk about the binary coding system of information. This is a typical system that comes from Africa. Mathematics itself, the foundation of mathematics, come from Africa. So African people have a big job. I think the next big job we have, besides continuing to foster that combative spirit, to restore balance and to restore justice, is to really find out who we are. It's to reclaim the role that Africans have played in the development of civilization from the beginning, and not just look at ourselves as being the cradle of the human life, the cradle of civilization. We are much more than the cradle. We are where you know, the human thought evolved in such a splendid way, where we had universities, when we have centers, philosophy, where we study astrology, where we study astronomy, where we studied mathematics and where we studied architecture. So we are masters, but we have to reconnect with that in order for us to stand tall. We cannot ask other people and impose on other people the concept of Black Lives Matter if Black life doesn't matter to us first, and we don't put forward the importance and the greatness of our life and of our contribution as a people all over the globe to you know, contribute to the rising of the human family. So yes, of course, young people, I'm so happy to see this happening, and using the technology that the ancestors worked for, and it's a great thing to be connected, because at the end of the day, one thing that defines Africa is the sense of community, Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the fundamental bedrock of all African philosophy and how Africa see the world. So Ubuntu, sense of community, the young people are doing it, and it's amazing to see, and it's amazing to be part of. Thank you.
Amen to everything you just said. I want to say Queen and Professor Diambi, because I'm learning so much. Oh, thank you so much for sharing those words of empowerment and of hope and of joy to all of those and us who are you know, I represent the African diaspora and the Black community around the world. Thank you so much. Now that we're at 2 p.m., what I'm going to propose is that each of the 4 panelists who have concluding remarks, if you'd like to say them, I'll ask you if you can say them now briefly. We have a few folks who have questions in the chat, so I want us to have the opportunity to ask maybe 1 or 2 of those questions. So did any other panelists have any maybe brief concluding thoughts that they wanted to add?
Yes, it's Moiponi here. I do. So, okay, thank you. So basically, I think what is important is that in as much as when you go to the internet, it is explained that the African diaspora started because the Africans from West and the North of Africa were enslaved. We need to also understand that ourselves as people who are from the South of Africa also form part of the diaspora. The Black challenges are experienced the same way in all the lengths and breadths of the world by African people. So what's important is for us to be able to find pride in our Blackness. I just want to speak briefly on this question of Black Lives Matter and the South African experiences that we have been having. I mean, before the whole movement gained momentum with George Floyd's murder. In South Africa, the police have been also brutal. There are a lot of people that have died during the lockdown due to police brutality. What's even worse is that you would find that in certain instances, it would have been Black police who are actually exerting this violence on the people. So I think what is important is that we must be able to understand that there actually is relations between wealth, health, education, and the living arrangements. This is where I actually want to explain the systematic injustices that as Black people, we've always faced. The injustices that we face have been created in a manner that Black people are not supposed to have the wealth. We are not supposed to be the most healthy. The education levels are supposed to be the lowest. And if you can check living arrangements of the Black people all over the world, it's the same arrangement. It's poor living arrangements. It's systems that have been created to ensure that Black people are unable to flourish. So racism around the world it continues to be rife. I mean, I just want to briefly speak of an experience that I had as a delegate to the Y20 that happened in Japan last year, where my colleague and myself from South Africa were the only two Black people at the airport. And funny enough, out of everyone that was there at the airport, our bags were actually searched. So it just shows, it goes on to show that the injustices are systematic. They've been placed there so that when you see a Black person, you see this type of person that is actually either a criminal or someone that is not to be trusted. So what we need to do as young people in empowering the African diaspora is to preach the message of African unity in our various countries. The concept of Ubuntu is a concept that we have been raised with growing up in South Africa in our families. So that is the concept that we need to carry to the other youth, that we need to be united. It's called Ubumbano. We need to be united as the young people today. It is our generation that is going to change how the world views Black people. It should be our generation that becomes radical in how we move forward in ensuring that Black people are actually are taken seriously. What is more important or more central to my heart is actually the question of Black women and Black girls. We need to ensure that the African diaspora is able to look also in the context of young Black girls and how we're able to assist them moving forward. The African youth, we must fight for an inclusive development because we are the majority of the youth in the entire world as Black people, as young Black people. So it is within us, it is in our hands, it is in ourselves to push, to influence our governments, to influence our friends, to influence our families, to ensure that African diaspora is known by everyone, and each and every African should form part of a movement that is for African diaspora. Thank you.
Mupone, thank you so much. I'm going to pass to Dr. Wale now.
Is it possible if I could go? This is Dr. House. I just wanted to give my concluding comments. I'm in travel, and then I have to unfortunately have to leave. So I just want to share some concluding comments.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I agree with everything that has been said, and I would just suggest to the next generation, those that are speaking and fighting and for equality, for equal rights, and I would just say that we shift the narrative, that we center our stories, we center our voices, that we reclaim the narrative of as the Queen mentioned, African ingenuity and science and mathematics, and just the great contributions that we have made to the world. And particularly as a person of faith, I think we definitely have to reclaim the narrative of Christianity, that it was not Europe that Christianized Africa, but it was North Africa, that Christianized the world. Many of the church fathers were North African. The Nicene creeds, many of the creeds were hammered out in Carthage. So just shifting this narrative that about Africa and the products and the cultural products, cultural ingenuity of Africa. I think that's going to be really, really important, that we reclaim our story, our voice, and that we lift up and we extol the contribution of Africa and the sons and daughters of Africa that we have made to the entire world. Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. House, and thank you for taking the time to speak to us. Safe travels, and have a good day today.
You too. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go ahead and pass it to Dr. Wale for concluding thoughts.
Thank you again so very much. Yeah, all the previous panelists have spoken so eloquently about this issue, and I just want to add a few things because I think it's important to just be clear with this issue that now is even more important than previously, and even more important than the future, because it is us now that must set the tone. And we cannot go back and change what happened yesterday, but we can change the outcome of tomorrow. So I think one of the most important duty of young people is to begin to debunk the lies that hold us apart as a people of African descent. It is a popular perception here, and one of the greatest lies used to keep us apart, that Africans in Africa, the native Africans, or indigenous Africans, as people may look at it today, are the ones that sold the others as slave. This narrative is very damaging, as it is completely untrue. There are other narratives that are used to keep us apart, that perhaps those in the African continent are not as concerned, or that they are not aware enough about the issue. But that's not true. This issue affects us all. Even at the local presidents, they have a perception of the larger context of racism and all kinds of ripple effect that comes after that, be it slavery, colonization, repressions and limitations of liberty. We all feel that today, regardless of where we are in the world. And I gotta tell you, the reason we created African Views was because of my observation of the beauty and the plenitude of African diversity. So that's why we didn't call it African View, but African Views, because there's so many richness to what we all bring to the table. What we are lacking today is cultural strength. And cultural strength is the only thing that deviates us from others who are progressing in the world today. We can look back and see why we have all these divisions, all these unnatural boundaries that confuses us and separates us and so on and so forth. But it is our duty today to repair those fractures. There is no more endeavor important in every sphere of life, in every sphere of humanity, in every sphere of our professionalism, that we must do our part in order to heal the wounds and mend these fractures. And it has to be done first in our minds. This is why the young people like you are so important, that you need to be empowered with confidence and knowledge resources that are essential into mending these fractures and wounds. Because we're so hurt, so damaged in our hearts. And in order for us to mend these broken hearts, we can't even do it alone. Our job is to convince other human family. And we have to do it by peaceful means. There's just no other means, because violence simply breeds more violence. And we are not equipped to fight this war. So we have to find other strategies to subdue the Goliath. So it is important for us to see that we have right leadership and that we are able to identify false prophets, because there's too many of them among us, confusing us, leading us in the wrong path. So I don't want to take too much of our time, but you can see that there is a whole lot to this. And you young people really need confidence. and right education to see forth and find the path around the maze that's created. And so many of that in every sphere that blocks our vision. You may know the quote from Henry Berry that says, "We have since blocked out any path through which light can enter the hearts and minds of people of African descent." He was a congressman. And those who divide us by the shades of our veneers, and those who divide us by our intellectualism, or the deep, or how deep our pocket is, and so on and so forth. But many of us realize today that none of us really matter. No matter how famous you get, no matter how rich you get, no matter what type of office you hold in the public arena, if you don't bring the people along, if we cannot identify your greatness with your people, you are an individual. So we have got to understand the concept of individuality, which really is a big problem for us. While individuality is important in the United States, as an American, on the racial level, it impedes our growth and our progress. That individual must be able to carry others along. And it is the duty of you young people to interiorize that and work in every way to promote that ideology. So I support and echo the concept of Ubuntu, which really provides the cultural background for us. There are lots that have been done. There are lots in progress to uplift African consciousness, African conscientiousness, and African culture and traditions at the global level. There is so much wealth in that. As a matter of fact, that is our wealth. That's where we draw strength from. With this, we're able to breed that cultural strength that is necessary to propel us to the dining table and to compete on the global standard. Thank you very much.
Dr. Wale, thank you so much for your compelling words and thoughts and call to action to the younger generation coming to stay lifted and stay on the track. Don't give up at this time. Thank you so much. I see we have, so I'd like to give the opportunity for some of the audience members, thank you all for being here, to ask a question. So I will ask if Bobby King can feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question that you sent me. And please be sure to identify who you'd like to direct the question to.
Oh, of course. Thank you. My name's Bobby King. I'm a member of BPIA. And I actually wanted to notice that I saw the same thing that Queen Diambi and Jonathan emphasized when I was in Africa, specifically Ethiopia and Sierra Leone, about the issues that made the African diaspora more shocking, which was that you only focus on the humanity of the person instead of their race. And I've understood those nuances being someone who's both of African descent and African American as well, that these nuances can act as wedges between Africans from the continent and diaspora. Well, I noted Dr. Idris stated that we must know that all these issues affect us all. My question is, how can we begin to bridge these divides between older diaspora and those who are starting to come in, as well as the African continent as a whole, and provide a more united front to help push the human rights of both Africans in the diaspora and those on the continent?
And for any panelists who would be interested, who is able to respond, please feel free to unmute. I see Queen Diambi has unmuted and shown, so I'll let her go ahead and respond first.
Oh.
Yes. So this is where the mission continues. It's the bridging the gap building bridges with the different communities. And luckily, today we have these media that we can use to get to know each other and to get to meet each other. I think that we have to understand that the work that was done to divide us, as Dr. Wale was saying, is quite extensive. It's ingrained in the history and the narrative that was told to us. You mentioned something very important about the lies about saying that African leaders or African people sold their own people. Before it got to that, there were centuries of fights and battle and complete decay of the governance structure on the African continent itself and the different kingdoms before it became such a chaotic situation where people resorted to doing some of these things that we are accused of. And also African people, we also lived under the propaganda that African of the diaspora, especially in the Americas, because those were the most visible one, were very dangerous. They were gangsters, because all we saw on TV was either there were a couple of elites who were amazing in sports and entertainment, but the rest of the Americans, African Americans or Black Americans, as we call them then, were, in jails or doing drugs or selling drugs, or women were prostitutes or maids and so forth. So there was a lot of propaganda on both sides to identify our own as dangerous and as people that we should not be engaging with. So when I came to the United States, I remember, my family in Africa saying, be careful. They didn't say to me, be careful with the white people, be careful with the white police. They said to me, be careful with the people that look like you, because they might be dangerous. So the first thing is, like Dr. Wale was saying, is, and I also say, is debunk all the lies, work diligently, and understand that we have the right to question every single thing we were taught about us and about others that look like us. We have the right to question every single thing, including religion, like, the doctor precededly said. We have so much that we need to learn, because knowledge is the one that's going to be able to allow us to now understand why the divide, how the divide, and where the divide. So we can now build and accept to get out of our comfort zone, because the divide is not just between, for instance, modern African to the African indigenous African here. Sometimes diasporic community from Congo do not engage with diasporic communities from Nigeria or Ghana. Cameroon doesn't speak to people from Ethiopia, and so forth. So even the concept itself of being together, it's something that we have to make a decision and be willing to get out of our comfort zone, be willing to question every single thing they taught us about ourselves and about themselves as well, because history is the pedestal that was built, that's been put together so that some people can, take the role of being supreme. And we have to deconstruct that. We have to go towards our own scholars that have done extensive work. I'm sorry, I have my dog making a little bit of noise. Sorry. About, these scholars. My dog is playing with the bottle, I'm sorry. So to deconstruct all these lies and all these falsification of history, so that we can find our common ground. We can find that we have a common origin and we have common challenges. And we already know that now, because the same treatment a Black man gets in America, we get the same treatment in France, we get the same treatment in UK, we get the same treatment even in Africa. So why is it that even African leaders cannot stand today, boldly and say, Black Lives Matter, when in your own country, you're not respecting human rights of the Black people that are in your country? So we have a lot of work to do, but that will come with really understanding why we behave the way we do and how we can change the way we behave. And again, to make reference to what Dr. Wale was saying, there is a major healing component that has to take place. And the reconstruction or the construction of an identity, of an African identity, is part of that healing. So we have to recognize first that we've been severely damaged by this experience, this consistent experience of that decayed our societies to the point that we became dehumanized by others, not by ourselves. But then now that we recognize that, we have to do the process that it takes to heal. And unity of the African people, the Ubuntu, to imbue the Ubuntu principle in every single interaction with people that look like us and others, is important, because learning about our history is not just for us. That propaganda was also taught to the people in front of us. And that propaganda allowed these people to keep and still look at us through the prism of lies, of a history that are lies. I spoke about scientific racism. So some people still today hold those views about African people being inferior, being ape-like, being incapable of organ. They hold these views from some pseudo-scientists last century or 2 centuries ago, who wrote abject things from their own personal of what African were. That inherited this propaganda also ought to be educated. So the education is not just for us, but it's for us to be able to present ourselves and to change the narrative about how we stand in front of the world, so that the world can also know that, no, Africa, what do we owe to Africa? So for me, the bridge is that you have to go out of your comfort zone, connect with people that look like you and others, learn about who you are, learn about who you come, learn about your great ancestors and the great contribution, and then get involved in community work to make improvement, and especially work with children. So do anything in your field to work with children. If you do books, you do music, you do shows, anything that you do, really have that willingness to work with small children, because small children are malleable. They don't have all these blockages yet. And when you go to a classroom and you speak about Queen Zinga, they don't care if she's Black or white. Children will just learn about Queen Zinga, and they will adore the story of a very brilliant and bright queen, like they will learn about any other queen in the world. So it's our obligation to get out of our comfort zone and to recognize and to make a serious diagnosis of our condition, because we have a condition. We have to accept that we have a condition, and therefore we have to start healing ourselves through diverse processes, including education, but also because we elevate our culture. We do festivals, we promote ourselves, we help each other promoting what we do. So it's important to really get out of your comfort zone. As a Congolese, I came to the United States, or when I was in Europe, I connected with everyone. I have friends from all over the world, Africa included, and also here. And hadn't it been for the African people that I met here, the African descendants that I met here, I would not know much of what I know about Africa today. Thank you.
Queen Diambi, thank you so much. And the last point that you made actually touches up on another question that someone asked about: what are some of the specific ways that we can continue to build and grow our Pan-African efforts? And as you mentioned, festivals and supporting, businesses and organizations that are committed to this work. I think that there's major opportunities in this area for some more formal establishment of Pan-African efforts, as some folks in the comments are mentioning. So I will I know that Jonathan had some response to this previous question about a united diaspora and connecting all generations of the diaspora. So Jonathan, I'll let you respond, and then I will let Dr. Wale close this question out.
Thank you. So first off, I agree with everything that Queen Diambi echoed. She said, and I'm going to try not to echo anything that she says. But to Bobby's point, where he said he feels like there's a wedge between the diaspora, Black cultures, I can really identify with that. And I think the wedge really comes because of a cultural perception of what various Black people throughout the world are like, or Black cultures are supposed to be like, right? And I can use a silly example for when I moved from Jamaica to New York City. before moving to New York City, I thought that everywhere in New York looked like Manhattan. But little did I know. And I moved to New York and I saw that Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn, they're all their own different things. And I think that really points on what cultural perception can mean for a person moving to a different country, or people interacting with different people of different cultural backgrounds. And the cultural perception of Black people globally, people from the African diaspora globally, as a majority, it's negative. Honestly, it's negative. And Queen Diambi also mentioned a point where she was told that she should be careful when she's when she comes to the United States and speak with people who are, you know, African American and everything. And if I'm being upfront, I've heard the same thing too, and it's unfortunate that I heard the same thing too. But I think all of that is based on cultural perception, and we're seeing massive movements to change it. I apologize for the piano playing upstairs, but I think all of that is beginning to change, as we can see with the Black Lives Matter movement, especially right now, this particular time. A lot of media platforms, Netflix has now released a Black Lives Matter category. Facebook, Twitter, a lot of companies are making statements supporting Black Lives Matter. And what we need to understand is that these movements are happening, and yes, they have a lot of energy and momentum behind them. And yes, it can change a cultural perception, but we shouldn't allow the talk just to be talk. We should really follow it up with action. Right? And on the UN level, I saw that the 54 African countries are having a debate right now, or I think it's today actually. They're having an urgent debate about a racially inspired human rights violations, about police brutality against people of African descent. And I saw that more than 600 NGOs have actually called the Security Council to urgently address systematic racism and police impunity in the US. So things are happening, and we just need to be aware that yes, all this talk about, you know, uniting the diaspora is great and everything, but we need to follow it up with action. What can we do? We need policies. We need people to bring forth like a cultural revolution, like a shift in culture. Media needs to continue promoting positive African films, or a better perception of Black people globally. So that's all I have to say. I know we are short in time, so thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Dr. Wale.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jonathan, thank you for informing us about the conference today. I have friends who are attending. It's important to know that this type of movements are going on, and it's always been going on for centuries, if not longer. But the problem remains that we do not know each other. People who don't know each other often are left to popular utterances or deployment of propaganda about one another. That becomes a really big problem. Therefore, education is key. For young people today, I think demanding the right education and the right pedagogy is key. I know that in New Jersey, they passed the Amistad Act. The Amistad Act is supposed to bring African history, true African experiences to the classroom. That act was fought for by ordinary people here in New Jersey. Though it was passed, it was never really enforced or put into action. These type of things ought to be demanded and to be ensured that it's part of our curriculum. So if you look at that, that tells us really the importance of education. And when it comes to our division, we just need to look at it as the entirety of the African people around the world as a tapestry of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, if you look at it, if we have the right part in place, then we'll have a full picture. The challenge today is that we do not have that. So education is very key. And it is important also to know that no matter how we try, it's not something that even we of African people can do by ourselves. It's important to bring the world along. So it is our duty to educate ourselves in order to educate the world. This takes a lot of great effort. As Jonathan mentioned, visibility is important in the media and so on and so forth, but it has to start in the classroom. And as Queen Diambi mentioned, it has to be ensured that children also are learning in the right path and that they are exposed to the right, to the truth about our existence and about our presence and our role in the world. But more importantly, it is crucial for many organizations amongst ourselves to come together, regardless of our perspectives on how to get there, but to focus on the right outcome that we need to build a cultural strength that is acceptable to us. And I can assure you that there are lots of movement on the ground. So the effort here has to include a great deal of learning from Africa and a great deal of exposure of Africa to the outside world. There are lots of things that are politically in place today that impede that interest, whether it's free mobility, whether it's economic issues, health, etc. It affects us all. And these are the things that we need to identify regardless of which department or faculty of profession or academia that we are involved in, to make sure that we do our part in order to make this happen. So I think that we have really touched on most of this, and I can assure you that our organization, African Views, is very dedicated to these issues. That's our primary concern. We are doing things at practical level to ensure that we contribute our part. Part of what we're doing is establishing a Royal Institute of Global African Cultures and Traditions in Africa that is under the operation of African tradition and customary elders who can bring about all the various wisdom, cultural wisdom, knowledge, etc., and institutionalize it in order to make it available for the world. We need to show our values, and we need to put them all together so we can have a full tapestry of what the African strength looks like. It is until then that we will gain respect, because it is through the interest of what we bring to the table that guarantees the assurance of our entitlement at this table of global standard. Thank you so much.
Dr. Wale, thank you so much. I think, so I'd like to be respectful of all of our time. This conversation is, you know, this could be a series in itself, because there's so many different aspects to explore and opportunities in this area. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all of those who attended in the audience, as well as our panelists, Queen Diambi, Dr. Wale, Dr. House, Jonathan Cummings, Mapone, and Bannery, for joining to share, to come to the table on this conversation. It's been my honor to be here as the moderator to speak and learn and have this conversation. So again, thank you to everyone for joining. Please look out for this video as it has been recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel for The World is Watching. And I wish you all the best, and happy Juneteenth today to everyone. Alrighty, thank you everyone. Have a good day. Alrighty, bye-bye.